Howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it's time to talk Path of Exile. This is going to be one of my guides for people who are starting the game from the very beginning, with going in with very little knowledge about the game. If you've ever gotten as far in the game as, say, the Cruel Labyrinth, which is something you probably do about level 60, then I don't expect you'll get anything out of this. You make two very important decisions at the start of character creation. So you can see here the first screen that comes up when you create a new character. And the first one is which league you want to play in. I'm not going to go into into the reasons for this in this video, but I would suggest that you play in whatever the then current Challenge League softcore mode is. So for the moment, at the time of this video, that is the Betrayal League. When the 3.6 patch comes out in a few weeks' time, there'll be a new league that will replace Betrayal. But yeah, going into this mode, your character will be in a challenge league for up to 3 months, after which point it will be rolled over into a standard character. And there'll just be more other players to play with, to potentially later on trade with, and also just a more alive game world. So, as I said, I'd suggest you play with that you start out in the Challenge League. Hardcore is a harder mode that where if you die, your character is immediately ported into the Standard League, and I generally don't recommend it until you really know what you're doing and also you have a good internet connection. Anyways, now you're faced with the choice between 6 character classes. There's also a 7th that you unlock fairly early in the game, the Scion, and this is the decision I wanted to go through a little bit in this video. All you'll see here is images of the characters without any further information until you click on one, and then
sinew and soul to serve God and the Order of the Templar.
You will see this roleplay appear.
Life upon faith, only to smite it aside.
And you'll hear some of the backstory of the character, which is mostly delivered in the game. However, the main decision that you'll make with your character class is something that will be influenced by a decision to specialize into subclasses that you'll be able to make at about level 35 or 40, depending on your decisions you make in terms of when you decide to prioritize advancing in your subclass, or ascendancy as the game calls them. And this information is not particularly clear at the start of the game, but has a big impact on the way that your character will play. So I'm just going to go through all of the different character options that are available, all the subclasses, as a very quick 101 guide, and give you a bit of a sense as to what I would suggest as a new player just starting for, if you wanted to play a spellcaster build, if you wanted to play a melee attacker, or things like that. So the first class is the Templar. The Templar is quite newbie friendly and has lots of ways to gain more hit points, which is something that every character in this game needs, a lot of hit points, and also ways to scale up elemental damage. He can be a spellcaster or he can be an attacker, but generally will default to making attacks with weapons that deal elemental damage. That's the most natural feeling way to play as a Templar. The Templar will then be able to specialize into one of 3 choices. There is the Hierophant. The Hierophant is a totem and brand specialist. Totems are a quite Path of Exile specific mechanic where you, instead of casting a spell yourself, you conjure a totem that will repeatedly cast that same spell. It'll aim pretty stupidly, but it will take a lot of hate from the enemies, and so enemies will often attack it, leaving you quite safe. Brands are something that's a quite new addition to the game, and they're something that I would suggest at some point in the future, leave them aside while you're a newbie, and then at some point in the future check them out. They are very strong at the moment, and it's entirely possible that by the time you're watching this, the skill Storm brand may have been nerfed, because it is extraordinarily powerful in low-level play. However, I still suggest, because it feels like quite an unusual skill, I'd stay away from them for the moment while you're getting the hang of the game. Maybe something to try on your second character. The second Templar option is the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor is a specialist in critical strikes with elemental skills. Can be spells, can be attacks. They can play melee or ranged, but they will usually be a spellcaster. They're a bit out of favour with experienced players at the moment, mainly because whilst they're quite good in the middle stages of the end game, they do fall off a bit at the very highest levels of play. This is mainly because the most powerful draw card they have is an ability that lets your critical strikes ignore enemies' elemental resists, but that actually doesn't work very well at the end game, where it would be better to reduce your enemy's resist below 0. So you can actually, so the Inquisitor lowers them to 0, but fixes them at 0 as well, so that they can't, at least for purposes of your critical strikes. In any case, the Inquisitor can be a bit squishy, is hard to build defenses into, and I don't generally recommend him to new players at the moment. The third Templar option is the Guardian, who is a specialist in making their allies stronger. This can include allies that you summon yourself through a couple of various skills that will conjure Sentinels of Purity and similar creatures that you can then buff. The Guardian's playstyle can either be a full-on buff bot that doesn't really do any damage of note themselves at all, but that exists solely to buff other human players. That is something I definitely do not suggest playing unless you're in a guild and have quite a bit of experience with the game. I would not make an Aura bot, as they're generally called, or an Aura support focused character until you really know the reason that you're making one. I'd definitely have a few level 80 or 90 characters before you consider making that type of Guardian. However, the Guardians that create allies that you buff as well as making your own attacks, they can work. They're not something I would say is the most newbie-friendly option, but they are functional. Second class that I'll look up is the Marauder, this big hulking titan here. Marauder looks like a traditional fantasy berserker type build, and that's a lot of what he can be. Again, you have 3 ascendancies to choose from. First and foremost is the Juggernaut, which is by far the strongest of the 3 Marauder options. It's the second most durable of all the ascendancies, but unlike the extremely tanky Guardian, which is an option for another class, not the Guardian, unlike the Gladiator, which is the most defensively minded of all of the ascendancy classes, the Juggernaut has a lot of damage options. The Juggernaut gains a lot of accuracy, a lot of attack speed, and a lot of defense, all from the one package, and is one of the premier options if you're planning to play a melee character. Very newbie friendly as well. A Juggernaut build will end up with a large amount of health and will end up with endurance charges in the mid game, which are an additional defensive layer that will make you very, very, very resilient. The second option is the Chieftain, which is a much more narrow option that scales fire damage from melee hits and also from totems. Has quite a bit of regeneration, and there's a couple of Marauder builds that are effective as Chieftains, but it's generally something that you would not start a character as a Chieftain unless you have a very good reason for it. And usually you'll have a plan to acquire a specific item, Zoph's Blood, that is very much an endgame goal for your character. And so I would suggest that you don't go with a Chieftain unless you're playing a build that someone else has designed that recommends it. Thirdly, there's the Berserker. In theory, this goes all in on offense and ignores all defenses except for life leech and a high life total. In practice, the Berserker is just in a terrible place at the time of making this video. That may change. Berserker may be buffed in the future, but right now, not only do I say it's not newbie friendly, but it's just not a strong ascendancy class at all. And in most cases, it basically is not the best at anything, and it's not even particularly good at anything. Next up, we're going to encounter the Duelist, who is this finesse fighter as he looks in terms of the way that the character models look. The Duelist is acceptable for new players, but perhaps not great early on, as it has less access to early additional hit points than the Marauder and the Templar do. But it does have an adequate amount. The Duelist can specialize as a Gladiator. The Gladiator has two very different paths that it can be taken down. One option, you go all in on defense, and the Gladiator then becomes the preeminent unkillable build in the game. It scales a powerful block mechanic with lots of hit points and lots of other defenses, and can wind up being extremely difficult for enemies to kill. But unlike the Juggernaut, doing this requires an extreme investment, both in items and in just sacrificing the ability to deal much damage yourself. The Gladiator that focuses on defense, there are powerful builds for them, but I don't recommend them to new players. If you want to play a durable and tanky character, I suggest you start as a Marauder and then go into the Juggernaut option. The second option that you'll encounter, and usually the most popular, is the Champion. The Champion's a powerful melee attacker that is well-rounded. It has more damage than the Juggernaut and less defense than the Juggernaut. And so it's whilst defense is very important as a new player, the Champion does solve a couple of other problems that you'll have as an attack-based character. It will, for instance, enable you to eventually acquire the ability that once you've hit an enemy, that enemy can't be missed in melee again. And so you'll need to make your first hit land, but once you've made that first hit land, all the future ones will hit. And this is a really, really strong ability. It means you can totally ignore accuracy, and at the same time, you'll pick up a whole lot of other offensive abilities as well. Champion's quite a solid option, and would be my number 2 choice as a new player that wants to make a melee character. The third option for the Duelist is the Slayer. The Slayer is a melee attacker that specializes in life leech, so basically gaining health as a fraction of the damage that you inflict to enemies. And also the Slayer specializes in two-handed weapons. The Slayer Ascendancy is unpopular at the moment with experienced players just due to two-handed weapons being fairly underwhelming at the moment. Doesn't mean you can't play them, but I don't think you will get amazing results from a Slayer. We'll come to the Ascendant later, which is very not new player friendly, but it picks up one of the biggest draw cards of the Slayer, and ends up being, if people wanted to play a Slayer, they will usually instead choose to go with a Scion, and then take all of the life leech functionality of the Slayer, but none of the two-handed functionality. In any case, the Scion won't even be available to you as a brand new player. It's locked behind completion of Act 3. And it is also just an absolutely terrible choice for new players anyway. Fourth up, we have the Ranger, which is an archery specialist. Although the Ranger can also use wands, which are basically like a one-handed version of a bow and arrow in this game, but they tend to have caster modifiers on them as well. So spellcasters can use them, but they can also be used in a similar function to bows to fire projectiles at enemies at range. The Ranger has 3 different ascendancies that all offer speed, and this allows them to, the Ranger class in general, to let you use your movement speed and your ability to zip around the battlefield with skills like Blink Arrow as your primary defense. You still need a lot of health. You'll still need to get to maximize your character's resistances at a reasonable point in the game, but you will be able to get by with less life than the earlier classes that we've gone through have. And that's a good thing because the Ranger will not enable you to pick up much life early in the way that that particularly the Marauder can. The Ranger has 3 ascendancies. First up, there is the Pathfinder. Pathfinder's quite an advanced class that scales up the power of flasks. Flasks for new players tend to be your healing potion and your mana potion. For more experienced players, they'll have to keep 1 healing potion and 1 mana potion, but then their other 3 flasks will be ones that either provide more damage or some powerful utility. The Pathfinder is a build that amplifies the effect of those flasks. It's one of the best choices for some quite specialized builds. Specialists in Val skills, which you'll encounter at some point during your play. It's very good at fast-moving builds that just prioritize zipping around the battlefield as quickly as possible. And it's also quite good at for builds that specialize in abusing certain stacking defenses. However, the Pathfinder Ascendancy is very weak unless you know exactly what you're doing. For that reason, it is one of the ones that I least recommend to new players. Second option for the Ranger is the Raider, who doesn't really pick up much defensively, but moves fast. I'm going to actually play a Raider as my next character in this league, but I'm going to... the fact that I'm playing them doesn't mean that you should. I think there's something that works better for experienced players that know how to use speed as a defense effectively and know how to exploit some of the tricks that you can do with mechanics like evasion and dodge. If you're not experienced with these, it's better to stick with hit points as your defense, and I would suggest that you instead focus on the Deadeye Ascendancy. The Deadeye is the third Ranger option, an archery specialist that's very potent at just brutally slaughtering weak enemies. The effects that the Deadeye Ascendancy gives do also work for wands, and even for a couple of spells, but in general they are generally most associated with the bow and arrow. The Deadeye picks up incredible bonuses, such as having your attacks chain is one of the options you can pick up. And what that means is that if you fire an arrow at a monster, it hits that monster, instead of just being consumed like is normally the case, your arrow will strike the monster and then will fire again from the monster to another target within range. This allows you to absolutely slaughter packs of monsters that are close together, where you'll fire an attack in that might hit 6 of them and kill 4 of them outright, and then 2 of them survive it. And then all of those arrows, some of them will fire off and hit other targets that you hadn't hit. Others will go and will then turn on the 2 monsters that survived the initial attack, and will fire an extra arrow at them. Very good at killing the one strongest monster in a pack as well. Deadeye also offers increased use of one of the most powerful bow movement skills, which is Blink Arrow, which is a skill that it's basically a teleport that uses a bow and leaves behind a copy of yourself. That copy will then fire out arrows, but they aren't very important. What matters is that you have been able to teleport around, and the Deadeye will have a 50% reduction in the cooldown time on that skill, which is an enormous bonus. The next class that we'll look at is the Shadow, this little assassin-looking guy here, and the Shadow is probably the least new player friendly of the starting classes, with the exception of the Scion, which, as I say, you can't choose early on. The Shadow is optimized for critical strikes, and whilst critical strikes are very powerful in the late game, they don't become a reliable source of damage until you develop your character quite a bit. The Shadow also has the least access to life early on, which will make you feel squishy. And particularly as a new player, you'll make more mistakes. This will mean that you will be more likely to get that you'll have more trouble with monsters hitting you, stunning you, all sorts of things like that. The Shadow can specialize as a trickster, who is a damage over time specialist that can either use damage over time spells or poisons. Can be very solid, but is quite hard to get started, and generally is a playstyle that I would recommend to experienced players. The second option for the Shadow is the Assassin. The Assassin is all-out offense and focuses entirely on critical strikes and poisons, even more so than the Shadow in general, and is very difficult for new players to use well. Both poisons and critical strikes are weak in the early game and don't really start to work well until you hit until your level's in the mid 60s, maybe in the early 70s, and you have at least a 5-linked, your skill having at least a 5-link, which means that you've got your skill attached to 4 different support gems, or ideally to 5, which is something you won't be able to afford to do in general until you are fairly high level. And we'll see in a sec what the support gems mean in practice. So yes, I would not suggest the Assassin at all. I would suggest that it is close to the Scion Ascendant as the worst option for a new player. Finally, we have the Shadow Saboteur. The Saboteur is a mine and trap specialist. Mines and traps are a fairly unique Path of Exile specific playstyle that don't really exist in a lot of other online games. They capture some of the feel of an arcane trickster style character, where basically you will conjure up deadly things on the ground, trick your enemies into walking into them, or more commonly you'll just throw them at their feet. That's the traps, and the miner will plant a mine on the ground and then detonate it at an appropriate time. In any case, the Saboteur is actually quite powerful for a fairly new player, but requires a fair bit of commitment to the trapping or mining playstyle, and I would suggest they make an excellent second character, but not such a great first one. Finally, we have the Witch, which character that you'll see here, and she is a spellcasting specialist. The Witch has one odd feature, where most characters tend to scale life as their primary way of surviving the hits that do come through. The Witch has a lot of access to Energy Shield, which is an alternative to life. Now, Energy Shield is a very powerful defense in the late game. It can be, in a lot of cases, it can be better than life. However, early on, it is quite difficult to come across. Energy Shield is much more dependent upon gear than life is. You can have a character with absolutely terrible gear, and they may have, by the time that you hit level 65, with absolutely terrible gear, you might be looking at 3,200 life, which is generally less than people like to have at level 65. But we're just using terrible gear as an example. You might have 3,200 life. If you were to respec that character into an Energy Shield character and have the same quality of gear, you might only be looking at having 1,000 life plus, 1,600 life plus 1,000 Energy Shield. Energy Shield has its own nuances, but generally is a bit less. You generally would want more of it than life. So on an endgame character that's, fighting the hardest content in the game, a life character might have 7,000 life, and an Energy Shield character might, with comparable quality gear, might end up with 11,500. And those provide roughly equal defenses. They both have their strengths and their weaknesses, but I think 7,000 life and 11,500 Energy Shield are about as good as each other at staying alive in the late game. However, 3,200 life is a lot better than your whatever you would have with equivalent gear, whether that be 1600 to 2000 life and 1000 energy shield. So for that reason, I'd be fairly careful if you choose the Witch. You're going to have some trouble with getting access to enough life. However, the Witch can work for beginners with what we tend to call a hybrid defense strategy, where you try to mostly focus on getting life and take energy shield as more than a bonus. It's something you actively want, and you have it as a second defensive layer. And then the Witch specifically has access to a number of life and energy shield nodes, so combined ones that scale both life and energy shield. They're not as effective as pure life nodes at boosting your life. They're not as effective as pure energy shield nodes at boosting your energy shield, but they give more than half of the benefit of each. And this is an option that will get you through the game. You'll find that you'll have to play a little bit more cautiously as a Witch than you do as, say, a Marauder that specs into Juggernaut, but you will be able to get by. The Witch can choose between 3 ascendancies. There is the Elementalist, who combines outstanding elemental damage with a not insignificant amount of crowd control via freezes. It's a very strong choice that's popular with experienced players and newbies alike. The second option that is fairly newbie friendly as well is the Occultist. The Occultist is a defensive build that scales energy shield very well, and whilst I've just been talking about the perils of energy shield as a new player, the Occultist does have a couple of abilities that do partially make up for that. And so for that reason, I think the Occultist is worth considering. Offensively, it scales cold and chaos damage over time spells very well. This combination of using energy shield as your primary defense and cold and chaos damage over time skills is very strong right now in the game, and is likely to maintain that way in the future. However, the Occultist does take a little bit more time to get started than a lot of the other options that you've got. Finally, you've got the Necromancer, who, like the Guardian, focuses on buffing allies and creating allies, with an emphasis on buffing in party play and an emphasis on creative use of corpses in single-player play, where you will activate an aura like Anger, which makes you and all of your nearby allies do enormous amounts of additional fire damage, and then you will conjure a whole lot of zombies, skeletons, or spectres that will then benefit from that aura that you provided. The longer that you play for, the more auras you'll be able to run simultaneously, making all of your summoned minions stronger and stronger. The final choice, as I've mentioned a couple of times or alluded to, is the Scion, and who then specializes as the Ascendant. The Scion is locked behind the boss of Act 3, and is, as I've said before, not suited for beginners at all, and provides very little in the way of bonuses until around Act 8. It is much weaker than the other options until you reach about level 75, at which point it can start to pull ahead for some builds. It's very popular with experienced players at the moment for a couple of reasons. The Ascendant lets you mix and match different ascendancies somewhat. Typically, her choices will give you about half and a little bit less than half of the benefits of each of 2 different ascendancies. So for instance, a popular choice for an archer is to take all of the life leech benefits of Slayer and combine them with some, but not all, of the offensive benefits of the Deadeye as an archer. This can create quite a powerful character, but is very dependent upon gear, and is very dependent upon having access to powerful unique items, and being able to get by in the early game when most of the Scion's abilities are doing absolutely nothing. In any case, don't make a Scion until you have at least leveled one character to 75. At that point, I think you'll know enough about the game that you can do the research into whether a Scion is worthwhile for your future character ideas. So in summary, my suggestions as a new player. If you want to play as a spellcaster, start as a witch, then specialize as an occultist or an elementalist. Experiment with different spells, but stick to one element until you know what you're doing somewhat. And if that element is cold or chaos, and your planned damage, your planned spells deal damage over time, then you should choose the occultist. Otherwise, if you're either doing cold spells that deal immediate damage, such as the currently very popular Winter Orb, or if you're casting spells that deal fire damage like Fireball, or that deal lightning damage like Arc, then I would suggest that you pick the Elementalist. You won't actually make your decision about which Ascendancy to take until about level 35, and it is respecable but at a cost. If you want to play as a melee attacker, I suggest that you either start as a Marauder and then upgrade to a Juggernaut when you complete the normal Labyrinth, or start as a Duelist, then later specialize as a Champion. In either case, I suggest that you dual wield. Not necessarily at the start. At the start, just use whatever weapons are best that you pick up. But in the current state of the game, dual wielding is just so much stronger than any of the other options. If you want to build a ranged attacker, I suggest that you start as a ranger, then specialize as a Deadeye, and use bows rather than wands. Wands are fine, but generally speaking, they are not in as good a spot as bows are at the moment. Bows just have more options, and early on you will want to pick up the Mirage Archer support gem and use it. It is an absolute godsend while you're leveling. If you're wanting to experiment with the Trapper or Miner builds that I alluded to when I talked about the Saboteur, then I suggest firstly that you save this for your second character, but start as a Shadow and then become a Saboteur. If you want to be a minion summoner, then I suggest that you start as either a Templar or a Witch, and specialize as a Guardian or Necromancer. Guardians will summon, or the skills that Guardians will tend to gravitate towards require them directly attacking in order to conjure minions with their usual minion skills. So skills like Herald of Purity and Dominating Blow that can that do the summoning are also attacks. And also the Guardian may consider using the skill Smite, which is an attack that also functions as a party buff after you hit. So the minions, for a minion character, the Guardian needs to be making attacks, whereas a Necromancer can sit in the shadows and conjure their minions from the benefit of range. There is an advanced option, the skill Herald of Agony, which I don't recommend to new players because it requires quite a bit of game knowledge in order to make it work well. It is a very solid option and functions as a minion summoner, and it's usually paired with either the super tanky Gladiator Ascendancy, or with a super fast and super dodge based Raider Ascendancy from the Ranger, which is actually the character I'm intending to build. But I do not recommend that to new players. It's something that you can experiment with, perhaps not even for your second character, but maybe for your third one. So I'm just going to quickly get started with going as a Ranger, and you'll hear the story that a very small bit of the story that's going to come across. I'm just going to call this one Test Radar and see if that name's available. Probably isn't. No, it's already been taken, so I'm just going to put a number on the end of it. No, I can't even use a number. Let's just go XYZ on the end of it. And because this is mostly an experiment, I'm not sure that this character is going to be as effective as I'd like. I don't think I'll be playing it all that much.
I've not seen a wilderness like this before.
So those are the decisions that you make before you start playing. The next thing that I'll show you now, experienced players will normally not bother killing the monsters in this first zone, but for the benefit of a demonstration, I'm just going to set up my controls the way I like them, which is with my main skill on the right as a right-click attack. And at this point, the ranger gets the skill Burning Arrow. Skill gems are something that is that's very important to get your head around. Skill gems, skills in this game are items, and they can gain experience levels. They can gain quality, which is another bonus. And also, I need to remember to turn off trade chat because do that first when you start playing. Trade chat is terrible for new players. Lots of people looking to take advantage of your lack of knowledge. And I'm also just going to block all of the incoming chat. So these skill gems are items, and you then socket them into a hole that matches their color in an item that you want to use. And what you will find is that some of these holes, like these ones, are linked to each other. That will allow you to augment your gems with the benefits provided by a support gem. And we're about to get given one of those during the first zone.
My mana is gone.
So we'll just keep going, and there's a special chest that will drop. I've really got the pathing in this zone wrong. It's been so long since I've gone through killing these monsters, but this is what we're looking for. Now, this gem is called Pierce Support. It's not a skill in itself. It's something that will augment other skills and will change them. So what this does, and you'll see the tutorial giving you some information on it there, it supports projectile skills, and projectiles from supported skills pierce 2 additional targets. It's easiest just to demonstrate this in practice. It will mean that if I line up a few monsters, instead of my arrow just being consumed, it will go through the first monster and hit the second one. And it will go through because it pierces 2 monsters, it will go through the second monster and hit a third one, and it's the third monster that will end up destroying the projectile that you're firing. It's very important throughout the game that you use your support gems as effectively as possible. And there's a lot of thought that will go into the decisions as to which support gems that you want to use for your character. This is the first boss in the game. He's reasonably weak, but he's basically a lesson in using your healing flasks.
I'm still breathing, that's a good sign.
Now, when you level up, I mentioned that you have access to a certain amount of life on each class, and this is what that means. When you click when you level up, this icon will appear, 1 passive skill point available. When you click it, you'll see an enormous map of various options that you have for advancing your character. At the start, you'll have very few choices as to where you go. Each class starts in a different place on the tree. So this is the Ranger. This here is the Shadow. This here is the Witch. This here is the Templar, the Marauder, and the Duelist, with the middle place being the Scion. As a Ranger, you'll be able to at the start you'll be able to pick any of these nodes that you want to take, so projectile damage or evasion and life. But you can only take nodes that connect to your starting point. So let's say, for instance, that I was to choose to take the evasion and life option now, which is what this build intends to do. Now, my next point that I earn, which will be when I achieve level 3, I'll still be able to choose this projectile damage node if I want, but I've also unlocked this evasion and life and this dexterity node. Now, we'll give you a heads up, in a lot of games, increasing your primary stat is a good thing, and having a node that gives you 10 to dexterity sounds like it would be great. In this game, not so. The primary stats don't do very much for you, and whilst you'll take them when they're available, and you will need some of them, you generally want to avoid nodes that only give you plus 10 to a skill, plus 10 to a stat. So we'll be able to pick up more life here over the next few levels, and although there's not very much in the Ranger, there is some very early on. Larger nodes are generally better than smaller ones, and so they'll feel like a big jump in your character's power when you pick them up. That doesn't mean that every large node is going to be useful to your character. Say for instance, just take one example, the current build I'm planning to build would gain absolutely nothing from this node Flash Freeze, which is increases the potency of your cold attacks and also cold spells with a focus on projectiles. I'm not intending to scale cold damage at all on this build, and so I would get absolutely nothing from this node, but it's still more powerful than this one that's this similar node near it. And you'll notice if we have a look over, you can search the passive tree by typing something up at the top here, and you'll notice that the areas that have, there's a lot of nodes that give benefits for life that are over on the left hand side of the tree. You'll see quite a lot of them there, especially in the Marauder section, a smaller number near the Duelist, smaller number again near the Ranger, and then very few near the Shadow. And the ones that do exist generally aren't so great. And also around the Witch, there's a few, but there's not as many as there are elsewhere, and they're not as good. So that's the sort of difference that you'll find between the various classes, and hopefully that can help you make the right early decisions to get going in the game. My general advice to players is, for your very first character, do whatever feels right, but have an attitude that you're not going to be playing this character forever. They're going to be a learning experience, and they're going to be terrible. So just pick up bonuses on the passive tree that just seem like they're good at the moment, with no real overarching plan for how your character is going to be built. Then, when you hit a point that you can no longer progress, or just that progress has slowed down enough that the game is no longer feeling fun, or is starting to feel less fun, at that point, you should then abandon that character entirely and create a new one. Your second character will fly up in levels really quickly, and you'll notice that your second passage through the game will fly by in comparison. For your second character, I would suggest that you focus on following a newbie-friendly build that an experienced player has created. So that'll be a build that made by someone with an attitude of making a character that's powerful, that's easy to play, and that functions well on a small amount of gear. You can search for guides on these in places like YouTube, and simply in a Google search as well, where it's usually a good idea to type in the league that you're playing in, because that'll give an idea as to the era of the game. So for instance, at the moment that when I'm recording this video, it is the Betrayal League, but there will be a new one in March. So type in the name of the league and the ascendancy that you think you're interested in playing, and then add in beginner build, and you'll find, usually you'll be able to find builds that someone else can suggest, that someone else is willing to vouch for. They're not always great, but they will be better than something that you'll create yourself as a rookie. So this will be your second character. Your first character will just keep going until it stops being fun, until progress slows down a lot. For me, that was actually a long way through the game, and I think at the time the game structure was a bit different. It wasn't in 10 acts like it is now, but I got to about the equivalent of the modern Act 8 before I started just not being able to progress. And that said, I tend to have an attitude in games that I want games to kick my ass a bit, and so I would have been getting killed over and over again in that time, making lots of mistakes, having lots of fun at the same time. If you've got less patience for getting your ass kicked over and over, then perhaps it's best to not follow this advice and just go straight into to a build that someone's created and that you can then work out how to play. Anyways, I think that's enough to get started, and then that should get you going to about Act 3 or 4, at which point you'll then want to go and look up some more information about where you want to go in the game. There's certainly nothing wrong with just playing blind and just doing whatever you want, and I'll leave that decision up to you.